Please listen carefully.
Hello and welcome to the Clubmen 1645, the introduction to the movie. Yes, we've come out here in the New Forest today to film an introduction because we've noticed after the last 2 years all these little snippets of videos have all become a little bit higgity-piggity and untimelined. So we've come out in the New Forest today to film this introduction, and it's going to be a movie starring me. Yes, just me, I think, really, isn't it?
It is, really.
Yeah, you'll be in it a little bit. And I think over the last 2 years we've been to Worcester, Hampshire, Dorset, Wiltshire, and that's it, I think, isn't it?
That's it.
That's it. And so our next project is in Somerset and Devon, where we should be filming about the clubmen there. But enjoy the documentary of the clubmen of those counties. Don't forget, Clubmen 1645, work in progress. Welcome to Clubmen 1645, and today we're back in Dorset and we're in Sherborne. And we're in Sherborne because we want to talk about the Committee of Array and the militia, who in March 1642 broke the Articles of Neutrality, and hence the start of the English Civil War as such, because the ordinance of militia by the Parliament, they formed their own armies back in 1642 as an answer to the Committee of Array, which were forming the armies for the Royalist effort. This garrison was set up in Sherborne, and it was going into the county of Dorset and pillaging and plundering. And that's why we've come here today, because we want to talk about what activity was in Sherborne later on in 1645. But we're here today and starting today in front of this lovely mural.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
It is, and it was done by the Sherborne community.
That's right, yeah. Yeah,
back in 2015.
2015, yes.
So and it depicts Charles II there, being put back on the throne, I suppose, and the fighting scenes in the street in Sherborne, which I believe was down, I don't know the streets of Sherborne, I think it was Cheap Street, I could be wrong, but there's obviously fighting between Royalists and parliamentarians in that scene. Can you see it?
I can, yes.
So let's wander around Sherborne and talk a little bit about the clubmen in the area. And this is where the fighting between the parliamentarian troops and the Cavaliers took place back in the Civil War. But we're not here to talk about them, we're here to talk about the clubmen, and I want to talk about the early days in May of 1645 when the clubmen got together at a rendezvous near Blandford to talk about Lewis Dives and the garrison here with the Royalists, and where they were fed up with the plundering in the county. And if we go round to the Abbey, we'll carry on with that story.
That's right.
Yeah. So but there's reports in several parliamentary papers about what they were trying to do against both sides, because they didn't like either side in the Civil War. So I'm just reading out the parliamentary reports of the day.
That's fascinating.
Well, yeah, it is actually. Yeah. Well, as we were down Cheap Street, as I mentioned, back in May, there's a great rendezvous of clubmen near Blandford. But I want to go back to March, because in the Protestant Mercury, a parliamentarian paper report back on the 21st of March 1645, it says thus: upon the difference between Sir Lewis Dives and Colonel Gowan, it is certified that there is another governor of Sherborne Castle, and it's also certified that the clubmen in Dorset have taken one of his colours and 40 horses with furniture. And with furniture they mean riding tackle as such, yeah. And it was given them great courage, and they resolved to die than suffer those atrocities and outrages brought to them by Colonel Gowan's forces. So Lewis Dives and Colonel Gowan had fallen out, and the clubmen had taken it upon themselves to settle the score with Gowan, because obviously Gowan was notorious plunderer, and in Goblinstone, that was his troops there earlier on, which the clubmen tackled when they were plundering there. So that is back in March 1645, and then we move to May, because when we move to May 16th, we also have a report, and it says thus: that the clubmen in Dorsetshire have a rendezvous between Shaftesbury and Blandford. That's what I mentioned on Cheap Street, being about 3,000 who acquainted Sir Lewis Dives that they would pay no more contributions to the King's forces, and they threatened to join Colonel Graves and Colonel Welder in the west. So they were parliamentarian forces in the west, and they were down in Cornwall and Devon. But it's interesting about they didn't stand for either side this early on, because it's always said that the Dorset clubmen were proxy royalists, but they weren't in the early days. I mean, it was a necessity near the end of the Civil War where they did this, but in the early days they fell out with both sides. And I'll speak a bit more about May the 29th, because there's a really interesting letter in May the 29th where they didn't want either garrisons in the county at all, but we'll film that with another backdrop somewhere nice somewhere else. Here we are in front of the conduit, and we've moved away from the Abbey with the letter of the 16th, and I want to read out the letter of May 29th, 1645, and it says thus: it was the same day certified of the West that there was a great party of clubmen again rising in Dorsetshire, and their intention of their rising, amongst others, is that they will not admit up and any inland garrison in that county. It was reported that they had sent to Lewis Dives requiring him to demolish his garrison at Sherborne, or else they would bear him out of it. So I'd imagine this pushed him out of it. Where it was said that Sir Lewis Dives gratified them and agreed to these terms, but obviously he didn't, because he was obviously still in the castle when Fairfax arrived later on in August. But that letter was also sent to the garrison of parliamentarian troops in Wareham. So they wanted both parties out of the county, royalist and parliamentarians. Abbey rings on a really cold, foggy day, so I don't think we're going to see much. But we're driving up here today to see where the clubmen met back in 1645. I keep saying 1645, but That's the name of the blog. And it's there was a large body of men met back here on May 25th, back in the 17th century. And it's quite an appropriate day because there was a constitutional shenanigans going on today in the High Court with Parliament. So we're sort of like doing a full circle with a little homage to the Clubmen which met up here back in those times. Here we are at Barby Rings, and as you can see it's really foggy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk up as close as I can get so you can see Barby Rings, but I don't think we're going to see much, but I can still tell you what happened. Stood here on the outer ring of Barby Rings, and you've got to imagine in front of me 3,000, 4,000 people listening to Thomas Young as he spoke the Desires and Resolutions Declaration to the people gathered in front of him. Now, Thomas Young is a bit of a man of history himself, because later at Shaftesbury, when all the Clubmen leaders were arrested pre-Hamilton Hill, he's actually described as from the Old Star Chamber and a man more eloquent and trustworthy. So, a bit of a cad, you could say. Now, the Desires and Resolutions Declaration, it was read out by Thomas Young to the 3,000 or 4,000 people who gathered here, was actually put together at a place called Gorehead's Corner. Now, we have no records of where Gorehead's Corner is. It's got lost in the time of history. But what I believe is just the north of Barby Rings here, there's this triangular field. And Gore means triangular, corner of as such. So maybe it was put together there, but we don't know. But we never know. We might find that later on through the archives.
I got 100 proofs, a symbol to crash.
This is Sheila, my camera lady.
Hello.
Who does all the nice fancy camera work. So, you know, big hands up for her. And we're going up here to look at the
seasonal hazards, baby, making it hard.
Okay. Now this is May 25th in 1645, so it's very early on when the Clubmen were getting together and trying to get things organised against the plundering from both sides. The Royalists and the Parliamentarians were both coming into the county of Dorset and running amok, taking people's goods, properties, farmland, and destroying property, and people were left sort of destitute. Here was a lawful document, you know, the Desires and Resolutions, which they put to both parties in the English Civil War, just to put a stop to the plundering in this area. So you could say early on it was quite amicable, later on it was going to get very bloody. We're going to go into Shaftesbury today, and Shaftesbury is where the Clubmen leaders were arrested back on August the 2nd or the 3rd, pre-Battle of Hamilton Hill. So once you get to Shaftesbury, we'll go to Castle Hill and we'll take it up from there. See you there. Right, we're in Shaftesbury and we're just going to walk down to Castle Hill, which is at the bottom part of this area here. But at the start of this pathway in, you can actually see Duncliffe Hill over my left shoulder on your right. So that's what I want to say really. And now what we'll do is we're walking down to Castle Hill where the Clubmen rendezvoused in August the 2nd or 3rd. come this way.
Okay.
This is what's left of the castle bit on Castle Hill. It's fortifications, earthworks, but there's not a lot to see here. So what we'll do is we'll go down the bottom and we'll film up.
Making it hard.
We're at the bottom of Castle Hill, which is right behind me. And on the 2nd or 3rd of August, this is where the clubmen met. And they met here, I hear you ask, because Fairfax had arrived in the county of Dorset. And he was on the preparations to siege Sherborne Castle. Sir Lewis Dives was the governor of Sherborne Castle, the royalist. And the clubmen were in communication with Sir Lewis Dives. And they've been in communication with Sir Lewis Dives since the beginning of March, when Sir Lewis Dives gave them some colours and some horses, and they were outraged about Gawain's atrocities in the area, and Sir Lewis Dives was sympathetic to them. Now by May things have changed, because by May Sir Lewis Dives wasn't dealing with Gawain's forces, and you can read in the Mercury Protestant, which is a parliamentarian paper, it might be True Observations, it's one of those two, but there's a wording in there about the clubmen changing their sympathies, and they weren't going to pay money to the royalist troops anymore to Sir Lewis Dives because of Gawain. And they just thought, unless you deal with Gawain, we're going to join with the parliamentarians. And they were threatening to join with Graves and Colonel Weldon in the west. But all that's got to be with a pinch of salt, really, taken on a pinch of salt, because a lot of it's parliamentarian propaganda, which would have been in this area at the time. But that's why they were here, because they were here and with the history of Sherborne Castle with Sir Lewis Dives, and they were here because of Fairfax and now arrived on the scene. Now, Fairfax had got wind of the clubmen being here and ordered Colonel Fleetwood in with 1,000 horse, and he stormed into the area and surrounded all the clubmen here and arrested them. And they arrested about 50 of the leaders, and some of the wording there of the day was great, because they said there was John May of Melbury, and he was a notable rogue in the area. And there was John Lovell of Somerset, and he was a notable stickler, and it was against godly men. Now these clubmen leaders were taken back to Sherborne, as I've mentioned, and among the people arrested here was Thomas Young, the lawyer, and George Hollis, but he was called George Hawes from here. But one notable person was captured here was Thomas Brevel. Now Thomas Brevel, not being arrested, gave the chance to the club in this area to get organised, and they gathered around the area to discuss what they wanted to do about the arrests that happened at Sherborne. It happened here, and their leaders were taken back to Sherborne. But that led to August the 4th, and 2,000 to 4,000 men gathered on Hambledon Hill under the command of Thomas Brevel, and that clash with Oliver Cromwell. Duncliffe Hill, Duncliffe Woods.
Ancient wood. Well, one tense, I've got
You filming it, yeah?
I've got you.
Right, okay.
And I've
Hambledon Hill. We're not, we're at Duncliffe Hill. But this is the precursor to Hambledon Hill.
You're going to start that one again?
No, I can't be bothered. This is the start of the 4th of August. It's the same day, and Cromwell's troops had got to Duncliffe Hill here, a place thickly wooded after seeing colours flying from the top of what we'll do is we'll go to the side and we'll start the story of what happened here on the 4th of August in 1645. Hill now Cromwell was here with his dragoons, over 1,000 of them, and with that he sent a lieutenant with a small party of men to the top of the hill here to meet with the clubmen. But now when that lieutenant was at the top of the hill, we met Richard Newman. Now Richard Newman is the same man who spoke to Fairfax in Dorchester on the 2nd of July, but on the 4th of August he was here. Now with that, Richard Newman came down and spoke with Cromwell. And he asked about the clubmen that were taken prisoner in Shaftesbury. Cromwell replied that they had been taken under General Fairfax's authority and are to be tried judicially for raising a third party in the kingdom. Fairfax did not want to see their places plundered, and they could defend any violence that came upon them. They should also bring any grievance against them to the New Model Army, whereupon the culprits would be punished. The clubmen leaders taken in Shaftesbury, if found guilty, would face charges to that nature. If innocent, would be freed by Fairfax himself. And with that, Cromwell with a small party went back to the top of the hill to talk to the clubmen and assure them everything was fine, basically. And they basically went home. So at this stage in the day, everything was fine with the clubmen. Now, by the time Cromwell got to Hambledon Hill, things had taken a different direction, and that's where the bloodshed was. Right, before we got to Hambledon Hill, I just want to say a point about Shroton Church, which is behind us, St Mary's Church. The bells at the moment are being renovated. Now, 2 of the bells date back to the 16th century. So the actual sound of those bells, which the clubmen would have been ringing at the time before Cromwell arrived here, warning of his arrival, you can still hear today, which is a nice little footnote to the Battle of Hambledon Hill.
Right, we've made it this far. Looking out over Hambledon Hill. And there's Hayden.
Well, here we are at Hambledon Hill, and it's right behind me. Now this is where the clubmen gathered on the 4th of August. There was 2,000 to 4,000 of them. What we want to do is go back to the day before that, the 3rd of August, where all the clubmen leaders, a lot of the clubmen leaders, had gathered in Shaftesbury at a place called Castle Hill. Now Fairfax had got wind of this and sent General Fleetwood with a troop of horse to arrest all of them, which he did. He surrounded all of them and took them prisoner back to Sherborne. Hence the clubmen being gathered here. They all met here on the 4th of August to march on to Sherborne to get their clubmen leaders back. But meanwhile, Cromwell got wind what was going on, and he was coming this way to meet the clubmen. So the scene was set for the battle. And behind me here is Hambledon Hill, and on the top of that hill in defensive position now, were over 2,000 to 4,000 clubmen, because they've got wind that Cromwell was arriving. Now Cromwell did arrive, and he was here at the bottom of the hill with over 1,000 dragoons. Now when Cromwell arrived here, he met a man loading his musket, and the man drew his musket on Cromwell and his troops, but he was overpowered. So that's how the day started. Now meanwhile, there was a man called Mr. Lee, who was on the top of the hill with the clubmen, who was being sent down afterwards to talk to Cromwell. And Cromwell was sending Mr. Lee back, and they were debating terms and their grievances. But this must have imploded during the day, early morning and during the day, because what was to commence afterwards was a bloody battle. Now, with the talks now broke down between Cromwell and the clubmen at the top of the hill here, Cromwell decided to send a troop of horse up here under the command of Lieutenant Gladman. Now, it was a show of force really, because it wasn't a major attack on the clubmen up here, but they rode up maybe this route here, because this is a back way to the top of the hill. But Lieutenant Clubmen went up here and he was just shot upon, and he killed 2 of his troops, wounded 9 and killed 4 horses. So by the time they got back down the hill and seen Cromwell, Cromwell was now not in the mood to negotiate anymore, but to do battle.
Gathered the afternoon into my glass. I got 100 proofs and assembled a craft.
Right, but Gladwin gone back with his wounded soldiers. Cromwell was there, and he wasn't in the mood to talk to the Clubmen anymore, and the battle was going to commence full time. Now, he sent Major Dudesborough up here with a troop of dragoons on horse, and they charged up here to the Clubmen, which were in a defensive position above me up here, and they must have charged up this back way because this is quite level, and any other place on Hambledon Hill is really steep, and to get horses up there would have been quite a job, and it wouldn't have been possible. Now, they charged into the Clubmen, which were at the top of the hill here, and Thomas Prevail was the commander. He was the leader of the Clubmen as such, and he cried out to his men. He said they must stand to it now, and that rather than lose their armies, he would pistol them that gave back. But they weren't disciplined troops, so they were soon scattered. And with Desborough's men going in with swords flashing and muskets blazing, a lot of them were killed. There was up to 60 killed on that day, Clubmen. In Desborough's troops, he lost about 4 or 5. You don't really know, because there's a lot of propaganda going around at the time, and all this is written from Cromwell's side and not the Clubmen's side, so he'd have put his losses at less. But that was really the end of the Clubmen in battle in Dorset. And the prisoners taken here was Robert Frampton, Thomas Prevail, and some of the main leaders, and they were put in the church in Shroton, where we were earlier on in the series of the Club in 1645, which we've been filming through the year. Hill now, because it's too cold up there and we wanted to warm up, so we popped in the cricketers here, had a quick cup of coffee, sat by the fire, and we're nice and snug and warm now. But what I wanted to say when I was up there was what the Clubmen were about, really, and how later on in life we can relate to what they were about. And we recently came back from a debate up in London about the putting debates from 1647. And it was more about the levellers, but there was a professor there, Mark Knight, who talked from the history section of the University of Warwick. And I thought his words were quite relevant, because his voice, what he said was, petition could give a voice to the grievances from the parish pump upwards, very much what the Clubmen were about. Petitioning gave a voice to regions and groups as much as to the nation. Petitioning was created at the local level, representing the views of towns and counties. This gave a region a voice within the national one, and importantly, it enabled the contested plurality of the voice of the people to become apparent, which, you know, relates very much to what the Clubmen were about here. Petitioning refused to accept that there was one single voice or will of the people, rather it revealed many voices of the people, a plurality of legitimate viewpoints jostled with each other in the public sphere. And I think they're wise words, and we can relate to them now in localism and activism, in local issues where the state imposes things on the county, and our loss of power with local councils and our loss of our voice of say. And that's what I wanted to say, really. That's how can we relate to the Clubmen from then to now.